It's James Murray. We're in the NetNewsLedger newsroom. We've got a guest who hasn't been with us in a little while, Chief Isadore Day, Ontario's new regional chief. This is the first time since the election you've been able to get back.
Yep, I'm finally able to make it here and happy to be here.
You have been busy. Following you on Facebook and in the news. Since being elected, you've put on a lot of miles.
Yep.
Looks almost like you got one or two more gray hair, shoulders a little wider, feet a little flatter.
Yep. Well, I've covered a lot of ground. There's obviously been a lot of issues that have been raised during the campaign, and certainly the things that I've been able to kind of grab a hold of right away after being elected, being to the Assemblies, being to a number of chief and council meetings, community assemblies, community gatherings. Certainly the issues are real. During the campaign we see a lot of things come out, but when you're actually, finally down to, brass tacks and getting to work, the issues are there. Before the election, the issues were there. After the election, they're still there, and some of the issues get worse, some get better.
The big one probably coming up, and it seems to be a major focus, is the federal election.
Right.
It's coming up this fall. As regional chief for Ontario, what will you be doing?
Well, already I've met with the Green Party. I've met with Thomas Mulcair. I've met with the Liberals as well. So those three leaders, I've already had discussions with them. Those discussions were, laid out in such a fashion where we're looking at all the various regional issues in Ontario, and Elizabeth May, Justin Trudeau, and Thomas Mulcair, they're saying the right things right now. We must, however, take the time to have a very distinct look, a very clear look at their policies, and we're also able to do that.
Now, you didn't mention the Conservatives.
No, it's one of those situations. It's a pretty consistent theme across the board. The Conservatives are really nowhere to be found, but putting checks in the bank, and they're really playing the part during this federal election campaign, and we know that that's just the way the politics are right now. And the federal government that we're dealing with now is certainly one that hasn't won a lot of favor with First Nations, for sure.
The issues, the major issue that seems to be getting support from the other parties. We had Tom Mulcair in the studio earlier in the week. Murdered and missing Indigenous women.
Right.
It is a huge issue. It's not going away. It needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Well, in Montreal, there were a number of folks that got up in the Assembly. As many know, that the push for an inquiry for missing murdered Indigenous women, it's not going away. There seems to be a lot of support among the premiers across the country, in many groups and sectors throughout Canada. People still want an inquiry. We are, however, also being able to lean on the roundtable process.
Yes.
Ontario's Premier Kathleen Wynne has been a strong proponent of the roundtable process, and as such has in the last 2 years with the Council of the Federation, she's raised this. We're also saying within Ontario here, First Nations want to maintain the pressure towards an inquiry, but we also want to be doing more. We don't just want to continue to push for an inquiry, just that, but we want to also establish a national dialogue. Thing is if we get people talking, if we continue the focused dialogue in terms of what the issues are, who can be involved in preventing these situations from happening, if we can help put social safety nets in place, well, that's going to happen through positive dialogue, partners working together, and that's what we're going to do in the meantime while we wait for an inquiry. Chiefs of Ontario.
So the work's already starting.
Yes, absolutely. We're just gearing up. We're going to be launching a number of strategic tools and processes in September that focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we're going to try to work towards the roundtable they're going to have in 2016. What can we do in the meantime to prepare for that?
Yeah, okay. Now, what's happening with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Well, we know that the TRC and the 90 some odd recommendations that came out from Justice Murray Sinclair certainly give a direction in terms of where the final report's going to come out, what that's going to look like. And again, just like the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue, we feel it's necessary to start to shape and put forward a process or possibilities and proposals that work with other governments, that work with the private sector, that work with education institutions. Let's work on a post-TRC strategy now, so that way when the final recommendations come out and the final report, that we've already started getting that work done. I think that's the thing. We often see these major processes like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. We waited for the government, and we didn't get what we needed to happen out of that process. So let's do something different this time. Let's get the work out in front. Once the final report comes out, we're going to be ready, and we'll have demonstrated that we're not prepared to wait for government.
I think that's one of the biggest changes that's happening, is that the number of people across the northern communities, across the southern communities, they're not willing to just sit back and wait. They're becoming active. They're becoming involved.
Right.
It's a very positive.
Yeah, I can't say enough about the people that are on the ground moving, that are willing to, push the agenda, that are willing to shape the agenda and define the things that are important on the agenda that we talk about. Listen, our people are talking about the land. Our people are talking about the social issues. Our people are talking about poverty. They're talking about the extreme outcome of the colonial policies that have affected our people for a number of decades, and they're saying, listen, it's gotten really bad. And I think what I'm seeing most of all is people are not just prepared to talk about the issues. If we listen hard enough, if we engage, people are also putting possible solutions out there.
Well, last week, with one of the grassroots advocates you speak of, Gary from Mishkegoguming, and I went for a walk from downtown Fort William here in Thunder Bay, all over the place here, and ended up almost in Current River across the city. And Gary was looking for his brother, who lives on the streets. And we checked all the unofficial homeless shelters across the city, and I'll be honest, I was shocked. There's people that are living under bridges. There's people living under trailers. There's people living in conditions that Canadians would not probably understand, expect to see, or accept.
Right.
And, it ties to, issues with health and issues with mental health, issues with addiction. And one of your programs you talked about before the election was a program called Homeland Reconnect. And it seems to me, from just the walks I've been doing and the people I've been talking to, that's a vital component too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the loop of issues, and you look at that individual that is displaced, that is homeless, there's a number of social issues, there's economic issues, there's even environmental issues, right? There's political issues. It all stems back to where people come from. Yeah. And we know in the case of First Nations people that, a lot of the people that end up leaving the community or displaced for whatever reason, one of the things that many of them want more than anything is to be back home, right? Yeah. Home is where the heart is, and home is where it's most safe. And a lot of times, you talk to people that are displaced, that don't have a home, that are wondering where their next meal is going to come from. I've talked to many people out on the street, and what I've found is that there's a moment where you connect with that individual, and it's like you're related, right? First Nation people are like that, and if you ask them, well, who's your cousin? Who's your auntie? Where do you come from? there's a almost like a relief, or everything that was guarding, or the walls come down, and you can really connect with that individual, and what those people are connecting with is their home.
Yeah.
Right.
Even I've talked to people who have never been to their home community,
Right.
and they're proudly from their home community, and they want to go home one day.
Exactly.
They may never have been there, and it would be like a Scottish person feeling in Canada that they were born here, but they have to go to Edinburgh. Well,
Right.
they don't.
Right.
But in the First Nation youth, especially, they want to go home.
Yeah, it's a tragedy what's happened, but this few years back, quite a few years back, there was this concept about being dispossessed. Rupert Ross talked about it. This whole notion of displacement and having to regroup, or figure out where you come from, or connect with your identity again. Listen, people, more than anything, First Nation people, they connect with who they are, and it's with the land.
Exactly. Shifting gears a little bit, the issue of human rights. This is an issue that keeps coming up. You talk to the Green Party, you talk to the New Democrats and the Liberals, they all want to move towards international acceptance of human right declarations that Canada should be working on.
Right. I think one of the more complex issues, but I think one of the simple solutions in this country is to deal with the racism that exists in the Indian Act. The Indian Act is a race-based legislation. You couldn't get more blatantly racist than that. The reality is that the Indian Act it separated a people based on race, and therefore if for the last over a century now we've been dealing with the Indian Act, and the lives of First Nation people have been conditioned and contorted by the Indian Act, then obviously much of our lives, for example, child welfare, lack of opportunity, feeling oppressed, poverty, it's all going to go back, and it's going to find its roots in the Indian Act. So what's happening is the federal government that continues to uphold and administer the Indian Act, how can we rightfully and full-heartedly achieve anything through even the Canadian legal framework? So what people are saying is that what's more true to a just approach is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that directly deal with our people based on human rights.
And that's a key piece, and it's always confusing that for Canada to go to the United Nations, and we've always had such an amazing international reputation, and yet on that issue, that seems to be this major stumbling block for the government right now.
Yeah, and I believe that we're now starting to see a major shift in the foundation of even Canada's dialogue. Canada realizes now more than anything, more than any time we've ever known before, that its identity is based on a dark legacy, right? Indian residential schools, the Indian Act. So I really see the country having to now take a look at these issues, and it's a part and parcel due to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
So over the coming weeks, what's on the agenda?
Well, I've been spending quite a bit of time in a number of the communities. I just came from Bearskin and also Round Lake. I am going to another northern community there tomorrow. But over the next couple of weeks, we're now going to be taking much of what we've gotten out of the National Assembly, out of the Chiefs of Ontario Annual Assembly, and the various priorities that people are putting out there. We're now focusing on the Fall Assembly. We're focusing on the treaty. We're focusing on priorities like the issue of dental, for example. We're realizing that we could be focusing on putting some very important questions out on the table in front of the federal government leading up to the next election. We could be saying, why is it that in the mainstream that folks are allowed XYZ treatment with respect to dental care, and why is it under the current NIHB program that First Nations are serviced under, why we get substantially less? And why does that seem almost like discrimination? What we want to do is we want to take all the priorities that are being laid out there that people have been putting forward in these election campaigns, and we want to get to work. What are the action plans? So basically over the next couple of weeks we're going to be coming out. We've gathered our information now. We're getting ready to again address the election, but also let's get some work done.
Thank you so much, Che McGuitch.
Yeah, thank you.
James Murray, the NetNewsLedger News Studio with Ontario Regional Chief Isadore Day.